Wow, it's kind of a neat morning. I've seen so many folks that I haven't seen for a while that have either been ill or living out of town, coming back to visit. There's people visiting who haven't been here for quite a while. Some new guests, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm just hugging everybody's neck, and here I get ready to start. Even Jim Rivard walks in, wearing a shirt that looks like my grandmother's sofa, and said, I know it's Jim, I can see the shirt. Wow, it's good to see all you guys here today. Just in means of a little bit of housekeeping, I wanted to let you know that this will be our last lesson in this series. The Lord has really directed me to Hebrews for next week, and we shall be off and running in the book of Hebrews. So if you want to read chapter 1, you are jumping into some of the most powerful theology ever put pen to paper in Hebrews chapter 1. So if you'd like to meet me there next week, that's where I will be. 1996 was a landmark year for us because that's the year I came to Karen and says, you know what, God's calling me to the ministry. I won't tell you what she said, but she, like I, was just a little bit skeptical, but I sold my part of the company and left and said I'm going to the seminary. I enrolled in Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, all on fire for being involved in the ministry. If you would have told me I would end up being the associate pastor at Crestview Baptist Church, I might have just said thanks, but no thanks, Lord, because I wasn't prepared for this. I was going to play golf 4 or 5 days a week and be a pastor at a retirement center. God has such a sense of humor. Wow. But I was about midway through my studies in 1998, and I ended up with some severe health problems, some bad doctoring, some really bad problems with my spine, and a sympathetic nervous system disorder, and I hit the bottom. I couldn't function. I couldn't do my schoolwork, and so I had to drop out of seminary. And when I was in the middle of a deep depression, I remember vividly praying, Lord, I don't get this. I had a really nice life going for myself until you messed it up and made me quit and go into the ministry. And I did what you wanted. And look, I can't move. I can't walk. I'd lost 30 pounds. I just couldn't function. And I said, God, what? I don't understand this. And then in the midst of the pain, I met Satan. I've had people tell me they don't believe in a literal person named Satan. I'd like to introduce him to you sometime. It is a horrible, scary experience, but then I realized this is his doing. He didn't want me in the ministry. And so after I regained my strength, the first thing that I did is march myself right back down and enrolled in the seminary again. I wanted to complete my education. And I don't know if you have ever experienced something similar. We talk about it in church life quite a bit. But one thing you can just guarantee is that if you are on a spiritual role, if you are in God's will, if you're working with what He wants you to do, then Satan will at some point try to stop you. And it's an interesting idea. Someone was quarreling with me about that sometime. Well, why are some churches growing, and why are churches growing that Satan doesn't bother? And I said, no, listen, Satan bothers any church that's growing in one way or another. I got to tell you, there are churches that are growing that Satan's not bothering. Prosperity gospel, he loves it. Preach on. Woo! Probably attending services because it's taking people exactly where he wants them. But believe me, if you are in God's will, you're going to find that at some point you're going to receive some resistance. And as I read through Nehemiah, I said, wow, this is like a flashback to me. I've lived this before. I've been through this before. So I want to kind of just recap with you some of the things we've talked about in Nehemiah so far. We'll be in Nehemiah chapter 6 today, by the way. I want to ask you to turn to chapter 4 because I'm going to skip most of chapter 4, but I want to kind of set the stage for you. If you will recall, Nehemiah was a faithful Jew who was in the court of the Persians. As a matter of fact, was highly placed in the court and was the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes. Okay, the son of Xerxes that we studied about when we studied about Esther. So the most powerful man in the world at that time, he served him at a very high level, had the dubious honor of drinking the drink before it was given to the king. So if it was poison, he'd die and not the king, but it was still thought to be a very honorable position. And his brother sent him word from the Holy Land. He had been back to Jerusalem, participated in the rebuilding of the walls. When the first wave came back, his brother sent him back the word and says, let me tell you, Nehemiah, things are not looking good here. The walls that have been rebuilt are literally crumbling. The gate of the city itself has been burned with fire, and Jerusalem is once again in ruins. And if you'll recall, Nehemiah prayed for days about it. And he did something very brave after praying for 4 months, actually, 4 months. He approached Artaxerxes very gingerly and said, you know what, the land of my birth is suffering. My people are suffering, and I would like to be able to do something about it, thinking no way Artaxerxes was going to let him go. But God moved in the life of a pagan king to allow Nehemiah to come back. If you remember 2 weeks ago, before our special lesson last week, we talked about Nehemiah arriving at the city and how he went around the entire town and looked at the walls. Well, he had some opposition. There's some names that I'm going to read in a moment that you'll want to remember because they'll come up prominently. There were other peoples from other countries and other nationalities around them that did not want to see Jerusalem rebuilt and certainly didn't want to see the Jews re-entrenched in Jerusalem. So they did everything they could to stop the process. They were foiled by the fact that the Jews carried a letter from the king of Persia, who said, it's okay, not only are you to cooperate with them, you're to help finance the building, which must have really ground them down. But starting in chapter 4, when Sanballat, remember that name, he is a Horonite, one of the other tribes right out just to the west of Jerusalem. Also, there was an Ammonite that's going to be mentioned here in just a moment, longtime enemies of the Jews. So these are people who had an ethnic grudge against the Jews. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they building? If even a fox climbed on it, he would break down their wall of stones. So they're poking fun at them. They're mocking them. Let me tell you, you might have a question in your mind, if they've rebuilt the walls out of stones, then how can they be so fragile? Well, if you'll recall, there was a fire. The gate was burned. These stones were likely limestone. And if anybody's ever had limestone like we have down in the hill country, my son built a real nice fire pit with limestone rocks around it to put a grate over and all this. And the first time he put a big roaring fire in it, all the big rocks cracked because limestone, when heated, just kind of crumbles. So the picture they get is this wall is so fragile it's a joke. Even if a fox, some say the Hebrew says jackal, but you get the idea. Even if a small wild animal walked on the wall, just its weight would crumble the walls. So they're poking fun at what's going on. So turn to chapter 6 now, if you will. I'll tell you what the rest of what went on in chapters 4 and 5 is they purposed to be rebuilding the walls, but they were threatened by Sanballat and his henchmen with physical harm when they didn't bow to threats. Or taunting, and they had to protect themselves. So when they built the wall, they actually did it by doing 2 shifts. One crew would work on the wall while the other crew stood around the wall armed with spears to protect the workers. That's how bad the harassment was at the rebuilding of the wall. But the work continued, even though they had opposition from the people around them. So, look at chapter 6. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. Now, do you know what his response was? Oh no. I just had to get that in. I'm sorry. It was too good to pass up. But I want you to file this away because we're going to talk about it a little bit later. That was significant because what they asked was fairly innocuous. These were peoples who had been historical enemies, and they had kind of a tenuous truce, but they sent a message to him, sealed with a courier, that said, come meet with us on the plains of Ono, which was kind of a neutral site. We want to talk about this. What would be the harm in that? Well, let me tell you some things that Nehemiah probably knew, and once again, we're going to talk about this more later. What they had in mind was not good. He didn't trust them at all. And besides that, he was on a mission. He had incredible tunnel vision, and he was on a mission to get it done. As we're going to find out later, he completed the entire work on the walls in 52 days, which was incredible. But he was on a mission. They said, come and meet with us. They were scheming to harm me. So I sent messengers to them with this reply: I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? Listen to this. 4 times they sent me the same message. And each time he said, oh no. Oh no. Not going to do it. So it's kind of interesting the way this thing is playing back and forth, because this is not a phone call. Hey, come meet us on Ono. Oh no. Hey, come meet us. This had to take place over months because they had to send the courier to hand him a sealed request. He RSVP'd sending a courier back to them and says, I don't think so. I don't have time to be doing this. Then the 5th time, so they've done this 4 times already. The 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter. Now let me stop right there. That doesn't mean too much to us. Here's what it meant to them, and it's very significant. A sealed letter was to be taken, and under pain of death, no one else could unseal it but the person to whom it was addressed. An unsealed letter was not only eligible to be read by others, but it was meant to be read in the town square. So he had upped the ante here. He said, okay, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to put this in the court of public opinion and ask your people what they think about it. The unsealed letter was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There's a king in Jerusalem. Now this report will get back to the king. So come, let us confer together. So they upped the ante. They just said, hey, let's palaver here on the plains of Ono. He says, oh no. They asked that 4 times, and on the 5th time they said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to put pressure on you from your own people, because what do you think would happen if the contents of this letter got back to King Artaxerxes? He's apt to be very concerned about this, because it says, wait a minute, the neighbors all think they're rebuilding the wall just so they can rebuild the nation and they can be a thorn in my side and maybe even revolt. And you've already proclaimed yourself king. That's not good. This report will get back to King Artaxerxes. Now do you want to talk? I sent him this reply: liar, liar, pants on fire. That's from the Hebrew, by the way. Your version probably says, nothing like what you're saying is happening. You're just making it up in your head. I love this. He didn't even dignify it with a response. He just said, that's stupid. That's ridiculous. You're making all this up. You know it's not true. I know it's not true. They knew that. They knew it wasn't true, and they knew knew it wasn't true, but that wasn't the point. The point was, did Artaxerxes think it's true? And did the people of Jerusalem think it was true? He was trying to stir up trouble, but here's what a true leader does. He looks past the riffraff The people who are just nipping at his heels, and looks at the larger picture and he says, you know what, this could have consequences for me, but I'm still rebuilding this city. I'm not coming. Once again, he says, oh no. You're just making it up in your head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. So he says, I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to take the steam out of our effort. They're trying to take the heart out of our people. That they'll say, well, wait a minute, if we finish this work, then it'll look like we're rebuilding an empire here, and Artaxerxes will come down here with the hammer, and we're going to be in big trouble. Let's just leave well enough alone. We're doing okay. We're intermarrying with all the neighborhood folks. We're doing just fine. What did Nehemiah at this point do? He says, they're worried about our hands being weak, so he went to the Lord, and what did he do? He said, Lord, strengthen my hands. You think he meant that literally? Possibly, but on a broader sense, he's saying, strengthen my backbone. Strengthen my people. Strengthen my resolve. Strengthen my will. And it didn't say, did he, that he said, I just buckled up my britches and went to work. I prayed. Did he know the source of his power in rebuilding the city? It's obvious that he does. They couldn't do it in his own strength, and there is later a lesson for us in that. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut up at his home. Let me stop right there. That means something. We're not entirely sure what it means, but it was significant that he said he was shut up at his home. There could be a couple of reasons for it. He could have been a leper. He could have had some other type of illness. He could have been there as a part of a vow. We think it's probably the latter, that he had made a vow that he was not going to leave his home because it was a time of prayer, because knowing that, Nehemiah would have to come to him. Okay? Are you with me? So he went to the house. He said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night, they are coming to kill you. So it's sounding like Shemaiah wants to be a friend and saying, look, there's a plot against you. Come to my house. I want to tell you about the plot. Let's meet, and let's meet inside the temple, which was a place of refuge ever since the temple had first been built. Okay? So on the surface, it sounds like a good idea, and it sounds like a concerned citizen. Shemaiah is saying, wow, you know what? There's a plot on your life. Let me help you out. Let's go and meet inside the temple. Note he said inside the temple, and he said let's close the doors, which means likely he was referring to the Holy of Holies. Now, you've studied enough from the Old Testament to know what about the Holy of Holies. Who can go in there? Only the high priest, and only at certain times. And even inside of the temple, no one there could go unless they were a priest. Was Nehemiah a priest? No, he was not. He was called to be a prophet, but he was not a priest. Here's his response. And I'm fascinated by his responses when people are trying to trick him, lie to him, or lure him into a false sense of security. He responds in wisdom. I said, should a man like me run away? Or should one like me go into the temple to save his life? So the first question he's got is, why do you think I'd run from danger? What kind of man do you think I am? And the second thing he asks is, and if I were inclined to run, what makes you think I would run to the temple just to try to save my life? I will not go. And then we've got what is in the Hebrew almost a parenthetical. It's an aside. And he's saying to us, to posterity, I realized God had not sent him. I don't know how he knew that. I believe that God revealed to him. He had prayed for a spirit of discernment that God had revealed to him this man was lying to him. But look what he said. He had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. So he says, I know, and here's the problem with this, is Shemaiah was a Jew. Listen, Sanballat was from an enemy nation. So you could expect him to be working against the rebuilding of the temple, but a Jew? I mean, you talk about a traitorous relationship here. He had sold out to the enemy, and he said, I think that these guys have hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Listen, all that Nehemiah had going for him at this point was that God had sent him down there, and the people discerned that. They knew that he was called of God, but listen, had he been discredited, they would have abandoned him like that. And with him, what also would be abandoned? The work. And so this is kind of a smart plot here. That, listen, let's see if we can entice him into going in to assume a priestly role when we know he's got no right to do that, and then the people would discredit him. Remember, it happened to Saul also. Saul got in big trouble one time for assuming a priestly role, even though he was the king. So here was a plot against him. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, oh my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who have been trying to intimidate me. So what we have here is kind of an aside, and you see just a glimpse of a prayer. And let me tell you, it's an imprecatory prayer. Do you remember Psalms? Okay. And when he says, oh God, remember Sanballat, he's not asking him to be merciful to Sanballat. He's not. He said, remember what this rascal tried to do and deal with him according. That's what he's saying. Remember them and also the prophetess that they called to prophesy against us. So the wall was completed on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. Now, what was the result of the wall being completed? Listen to this. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work could have been done with the help of God. Remember, we talked a couple of weeks ago about when the Hebrew children were first brought into the promised land, that victory after victory, nation after nation fell. And what happened to the other nations when they saw that happening? They said, this is supernatural. These people are being led by a God that we can't fight. And so they started coming to them and surrendering and even offering tribute. The same thing happened here. The people around there said, this ragtag band could not have built that temple in 52 days. It must be God. And so they were very afraid. An interesting thing happened several years ago when I, in the midst of a busy day in Camp Crestview, went to Lisa and said, man, you guys did an incredible job here. And she said, you know what we've come to realize over the years is that we can't do it. This thing can't happen unless God's doing it. And if you've ever been in the middle of Camp Crestview as a cog in the big machinery and realized, I don't know how this is happening, but it couldn't be happening apart from God's power. That's what happened there. People looked at it and says, my goodness, I can't imagine how these people did this. In those days, the nobles of Judah were sending letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Arah, and his son Jehoahan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Let me tell you what all that means. You don't have to memorize all the names, okay? Tobiah was from a neighboring country, but had ingratiated himself through political alliances and actual intermarriage with many of the leading citizens in Judah. And so what you're starting to see here is he's setting the table to say, trouble's coming. Because we've got a fifth estate. We've got someone inside the walls, someone inside the people who have already formed alliances outside, and that's going to be trouble. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds and telling him what I'd said, and Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. So we know that even though the work has been done, the walls have been rebuilt, the gate has been replaced, the people around him are saying, golly, that still there's trouble brewing. So mark that down, because we're not going to follow it up next week, because we're going to be in Hebrews. As I looked at this, though, I was just really struck by the comparison between what went on then and what goes on today. Sometimes I really feel sorry for teachers who teach this like a history lesson. Did it happen? Yes. Is it good history? Yes. Is it good to remember lessons learned from history? Yes. But let me tell you what, the same things happen today. And God intended us to learn from the lessons here to apply to today. Here's my central theme that I found today that just leaped off the page, because remember recently the staff got together for a day of prayer to ask God to show us where you're going to be working this year, God, and in the next several years, because this town's about to explode. What do we need to do? Remember, and you'll see it up on the screen, here's who we are. We're lifting up Jesus. We're learning to follow Him. And we're leading others to Him. Now, that's nice and alliterative so that you can remember it, but I want you to stop and think. Lifting up Jesus. We're here to worship today. We're here to worship. Not what do I get? We're here to lift Him up. We are here to learn, to study through His Word, to follow Him. That's discipleship. So we got worship and discipleship and leading others to Him, which is a part that so many churches forget today because they get so involved in enjoying their worship that they forget, you know what, we're also here to lead other people to Him. Evangelism. We got worship, discipleship, and evangelism. What do you think Satan thinks about that? Probably pretty unhappy about it. So we will face adversity. We have faced adversity. Sometimes it's in the form of the Georgetown City Council. It's no knock against them. They've cooperated with us in a number of ways, but you'd be amazed at the roadblocks that get thrown up in our way that just don't seem to get thrown up in the way of other people. Lots of things could happen that could slow us down or stop what we see as being God's work in this church. But here's what I think we ought to pray for. And let me tell you, I think by extension you can take this and apply it to your own personal situation. Let's look at it from a church perspective. But from your perspective, when you are in God's will, you will face adversity. And when you face adversity, I would suggest you do like Nehemiah did and pray for 4 things. Focus. I want you to stop and think about that. Do you know how easy it is to get distracted around here? One of the things that I had real difficulty with when I moved from the secular world to being on staff here. Well, the first is that I used to have 10,000 employees who did anything I said to do. Now, nobody here does anything just because I say to do it. Nobody. Not one person. Another thing is that it used to be I could plan my day pretty much when I was in the secular world. Remember daytimers and personal digital assistants, PDAs? I could have those things and have my day pretty well planned out. Here, whatever I plan is subject to change and almost always will be. Almost always will be. I can't plan when people die. I can't plan when people go to the hospital. And I just want you to know, congratulations. Last week, I know that you all called around among yourselves and said, hey, let's all go to the hospital this week. Because that's kind of what happened the last 2 weeks. So you can't plan for that. And so I've got a couple of tasks that I really need to get done to build 2 new Sunday school units. I got to get to work on it. And I had some time set out. Didn't get started. Didn't even get started. Distractions all day long. Almost all of them worthwhile. But they were distractions. And don't think that Satan's not out there just sending distractions one right after another. And so what Nehemiah did was focus. 4 times he says, oh no, oh no, oh no. I'm not coming to the plane of oh no. I got a job to do. Sometimes we have to get that singular focus, not only as a church, but in our personal lives, that I am not going to be dissuaded. I'm not going to be knocked off my game, and take that extra bit of time to get caught up reading Facebook or emailing people or just watching that TV show that not going to do anything for me long term anyway. The second is discernment. One of the things that I pray earnestly for, I pray for wisdom and discernment. And just about every staff meeting. I don't think I've been given the natural gift of discernment. I have learned that I have surrounded myself with friends, brothers and sisters, and Kay can testify this. We've been on visits quite often while I'll say, I need to know what you think about this because I don't get a reading. I just don't know what God's will is, and she can tell me. She can tell me. I've got friends that I've learned to trust their discernment, and I prayed that God would give me discernment, that I tend to get hung up on my own plans and not seek His, for example. I'd like to know what your plan is, God, not ask you to bless mine. Another one is courage. In the face of threats, Nehemiah refused to surrender. Look time and time again, particularly, for example, in verse 9. In verse 9, it said, they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it won't be completed, but I prayed, strengthen my hands. So at a time when other leaders could have become weak-kneed, he refused to buckle in. I think that being a pastor at a church in the future could be a pretty dangerous proposition. I think that being a Christian in the workplace could be a pretty dangerous proposition. I think being a believer, period, could become a pretty dangerous proposition. And there's going to come a time when somebody's going to threaten us. I think it's going to be sooner than later. I think you just ask pastors in Houston, where already the heavy hand of the city government has come down and said, we want a list of all your sermons that you've preached on these topics, and we want transcripts of your notes. And when the heavy hand of government comes down, it could get easy to get weak-kneed and give in to them. But the fact is, they've got no rights to those. And to their credit, the pastors in Houston stood up and said, we're not going to do it. They said, oh no. Oh no. The fourth thing is persistence. That goes quite hand in hand with focus, I think. I think you can persist in the wrong path. But once you have discerned that you are in God's will, it's going to take persistence sometimes. I think I had to learn that the hard way and persist and complete my seminary education. Because I'm not going to boast and say, well, Satan sure wanted to stop me because he knew I'd be a real problem for him. But the fact is, the Holy Spirit was moving in my life, and any person Satan doesn't like that in. He didn't want me to finish seminary and go to work, be a pastor. He doesn't want anybody to do that. So I think we have to persist even in the face of difficulties. That says easy and does hard. Okay? It says easy and does hard. Because the times today aren't friendly to us. And so what we need to do is persist in a loving manner. I had a discussion this week with a new friend. And one of the things we talked about is that we have to love aggressively, but persistently stand for truth. We cannot give that up and let society change us. And that's what Nehemiah did in the face of his threats from his enemies. He said, I'm not going to buckle into you, your way of life, or your God, because I am persisting in doing the work that my God has given me. Next week, read chapter 1 of Hebrews, if you will, and we'll take off in a new direction. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your word, for how it can be used, a lesson from so many hundreds of years ago in our lives today, in the lives of our church, in the lives of our churches, in the lives of our members, that Father, that when Satan steps in to try to hinder your work, that we pray that you'd give us strength to be able to counter it. I want to thank you, Father, for this special day when we do observe the ordinance of the Lord's Supper, and ask that as we partake of that, you find us worthy, and that you bless each and every heart of every believer who gathers today. For I ask it in your name. Amen.